At this point, our next presentation is on the Pathways in Autism study, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Sazatmari, the Chief Child and Youth Mental Health Collaboration at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health, as well as the Hospital for Sick Children, as well as the Director of the Division of Child and Youth Mental Health at the University of Toronto.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here at the Alliance Summit. I remember when this started, and there were just a couple of people here, and it's amazing to me to see all the people that are here now, and of course all the people that are online. And your commitment and leadership is really quite remarkable to changing the landscape for autism advocacy within Canada and internationally as well. And of course, it's lovely to be here to see old friends, I can't believe it, and also to make some new friends, which I hope to do over the course of the day. Next slide, please. Oh, I've got it. I can do it. There we go. This is my financial disclosure. None of these represent a conflict of interest. So the objectives of the presentation are to, first of all, talk about how Pathways started, which was really a patient-oriented research project in the late 1990s. Okay, so everybody who was born after 1990, raise your hand. So this is like ancient history, I can reassure you. I want to share with you as well some key findings from the Pathways study. I want to draw out some of what we think are the clinical and policy implications of the study, and then just give you a glimpse of what's next in the story of this project. So all this started with something called CARN, which stands for Canadian Autism Intervention Research Network. It's one of the best acronyms that we came up with, because CARN is a pile of stones that shows you the way. And all this started with an informal group of stakeholders and researchers that got together mid-1990 to the end of the 1990s. And we held conferences each year to identify evidence gaps in early intervention in autism. You may remember those years there was enormous conflict in Canada that went all the way to the Supreme Court about early intervention in autism. And many of us thought that this was because there wasn't enough evidence to inform what the policy should be. So we wanted to try and fill those evidence gaps, but we brought together not only researchers, but people with autism, parents and caregivers, policymakers and clinicians. And we held these conferences over a number of years to refine a research agenda, to come up with some different research questions. Then in about 2001, my memory is a little vague on the exact date, but just bear with me. We held a final conference. We formulated what we thought were the 10 most important research questions that had come up over the course of these CARN conferences. And we gave everybody $100,000 worth of monopoly money. And we put the questions on a number of tables, and people at that conference were able to put their monopoly money on the question that they thought ought to be researched at that particular time. Some of you are nodding your heads. You were there. You remember that that event. So this really was a project that then started with stakeholders and people in particular with lived experience telling researchers what the most important question to investigate was. And that question was, what factors account for a good outcome in autism? So we took that question, a group of investigators from across Canada, submitted an application to Canada's main health research funding organization, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and I don't know how, but we got the grant on the first try, and off we went in about 2004. This is the sort of current makeup of the research team. Many of the members of the team are here at this moment. But I want to acknowledge it's amazing really to have the same group of people working together over a 20-year period. That doesn't happen in science very often, but I think it does show the commitment and passion that this group of people have had for this particular project. Also want to acknowledge all the different funding sources that helped us along the way. CIHR was good to us, but didn't give us continuous funding, so there were a couple of years where there were gaps. The Seneve Foundation, who's here, a special shout out to them for saving us in that gap year, but also funding from Alberta and British Columbia and Autism Speaks Canada that I particularly want to express our gratitude to. So the design of the study, pretty simple. We were based in 5 different sites across Canada, so this is the first pan-national, pan-Canadian study of autism. Halifax, Montreal, Hamilton, Edmonton, and Vancouver. And so sites, data collection sites in each of those cities. We were able to recruit 421 kids with autism, and they specifically had to be between 2 and 4 years, 11 months of age. And the plan was to follow them from that early diagnostic period when they got the diagnosis to their transition-aged youth area, graduating from high school. And the outcome domains that we were particularly interested in studying were autism features, cognition, like language, daily functioning, and mental health. I'll just say, mental health in 2004 in autism was not a topic that had been studied very much. And I think one of the other things I want to just highlight, the innovations, was that we recognized, because of stakeholder input, how important mental health was, and so that was an important priority for us right from the very beginning. We collected data in multiple different ways from multiple informants, so checklists, interviews, questionnaires. We collected data from parents, caregivers, from the kids with autism themselves, and from teachers. The basic idea in the Pathways study was that autism was an incredibly heterogeneous disorder. So we wanted to study that heterogeneity over time. We would start from the point of diagnosis, 2 to 4 years of age, school entry, elementary school, and then in secondary school, in high school, to the point of graduation in high school. The second key element of the design was that we wanted to look at different contexts, and by context I mean the family, the services that the kids were receiving, the treatments, the school that they were nested in, and the communities within which they were living. So we saw the child as nested within these different ecosystems, and the variables that we wanted to look at included not only child variables, but these other contextual variables as well. Again, just to emphasize, that was an innovation in 2004 because most research in autism was based on characteristics of the child and not the context. And again, this was something that we learned from the stakeholders, was to pay attention to the context. You idiots, they said to us. No, they didn't. They didn't say that. I'm just going to highlight right from the very beginning, some of the key findings of the study that we've learned over now. And I'll just mention that the study team is at the back. Raise your hands, everybody that was involved in the study. an amazing study team. We're still going strong. The study will end, the funding period will end in 2025, will end next year, but I will tell you what's next. So the key findings, I think, over all these years, having followed these kids for that long a time, are some of the highlights I want to just share with you. One is that the age of diagnosis is too far separated from the point at which parents first raise concerns about their child's development. And I'll go into that. Each of these points I'll go into in a little more detail, but I want to just put them in front of you right at the very beginning. Second finding, autistic children show remarkable variation in their developmental trajectories. That is, how do they change over time? The importance of key transitions, the transition into school, the transition into high school. The concept of chronogeneity. So this is a concept that Stelios Georgiadis came up with, and I'll explain that a little bit more, what it means, but that really captures this idea of heterogeneity in development, and I think it's a really cool idea. Some autistic children do remarkably well, and this, I think, is something that's very different than what is often interpreted in the literature. And it's important to pay attention that, in fact, these contextual variables do play a role in influencing who does well, in influencing these developmental trajectories. And then the final really important message and finding for us is the importance of listening to autistic voices in the research enterprise. And this issue of engagement of those with lived experience that we started with has only become more and more important as time goes on. So this is a picture of a young Lonnie, although he's still wearing the same shirt, he tells me. That's in the picture here, but Lonnie took charge of the picture of the study looking at the age of onset and age of diagnosis. And the important finding of this paper is that there was a 19-month gap between when parents first became concerned about their child's development and when they received a diagnosis. Remember, this is only in kids between 2 and 4 years of age, so it's a very sort of restricted time window, but even within that window, there's a 19-month delay. And that is something that's modifiable. That is something that we can do something about. The two factors that seem to be associated with this delay in diagnosis was that kids who had better language and cognitive abilities were diagnosed late, probably because the medical folks making the diagnosis didn't have a full appreciation of the full spectrum of manifestations of what autism could look like at an early age, and also more repetitive interests and focused interests and repetitive activities. I'm not sure we understand the reason for that. Other variables like the sex assigned at birth or some of the other demographic factors weren't associated with the age of diagnosis. And I think the message here is that we have a lot of work to do in education about early manifestations of autism so that there's an appreciation of the full spectrum so that we can get that 19 months down to 1 or 2 months. It's not really that complicated, guys, to make a diagnosis. How do autistic children develop? So this has occupied a lot of our energy and thought over the years. And bottom line is that there's so much variation in how the kids change over time, it is virtually impossible to generalize from that early window of 2 to 4 years of age as to how they're going to end up in high school. There is a lot of variation in how autistic children change, and that's this idea of heterogeneity that we wanted to capture. And I'm going to give some examples of this with respect to autism functioning, autism features and functioning, and anxiety over time. So this is work that was carried out by Stelios. I have to give him credit for this. And this looks at autism features over time and how the entry to school is a transition point. So all the dots, do I have a pointer on this? I don't think so. Of course, I can't do that anyway because I can't point at that and it won't. It's another sign of my advancing age. At least I have a different shirt on than I had in that in that picture. So this is how kids on their ADOS, which is a measure of autism features, change over time. So higher scores means more symptoms, lower scores means less autism features. And then you do a fancy statistical technique. This is over time from the point that they were diagnosed till after their school entry into grade 1 and grade 2. You do a statistical technique and you find out that most of the variation can be accounted for by two groups of kids. One group of kids who have more features at the beginning, and they tend to be fairly stable over time. And then a second group that shows improvement over time. However, at school entry, there's a plateau, and in fact, a little bit of a worsening in their autism features, so that they go up, so that there seems to be, at this transition into school, a slowing down in their improvement. For the one group, they stay on their trajectory of moving downwards, so their autism features continues to improve, but that group at the top level there, they continue to have a lot of features and they don't improve as time goes on. Now, having said that, the graphs on the right show the variation within those two main trajectories, and each line is an individual kid. So you can see the remarkable heterogeneity within even those two groups over time, which just emphasizes the point about how variable it is and how difficult it is to make predictions. So that's autism features. I want to just illustrate how another domain, so functioning, this is the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale on the right. Instead of two developmental trajectories over time, we now have, for this domain, 3 developmental trajectories. So the higher is better adaptive functioning, and the lowest line is lower adaptive functioning. And the top line shows improvement from the beginning over time. The middle group is pretty stable, and then the bottom group is lower and continues to be a little bit lower over time. The most important point is that these two domains, autism features and adaptive functioning, have a different pattern of change over time, and they don't correlate with each other. In other words, the kids whose autism features are getting better are not necessarily the kids who have better adaptive functioning over time. So the yoking of developmental trajectories is very, very weak. These are the developmental trajectories of anxiety. So this is from the point of baseline at the start, 2 to 4 years of age, all the way now to 11, 12 years of age. And for anxiety symptoms, we come up with 4 developmental trajectories. Again, group 4, the 13%, they have a lot of anxiety at the beginning, and they remain with a lot of anxiety over time. There's another group, group 3, 20%, who start low, but then their anxiety begins to increase at around 7 years of age, and it reaches almost to the same level as the group with a lot of anxiety symptoms. There's one group that's higher, they then improve over time, and then there's a group that has low anxiety symptoms, pretty stable over time. Point being, anxiety trajectories are different than autism feature trajectories, are different than adaptive functioning trajectories. So each area of development appears to have its own pattern of change. Some kids stay the same on a particular domain, some get better, some get worse, like those kids with anxiety, whose anxiety goes up over time. And not all domains change at the same rate. So a kid on a particular trajectory may slow down or speed up as time goes on along their individual trajectory. The other important finding, I think, is that autistic kids look different as time goes on. It's almost as if there's a fanning out of their developmental trajectories. The heterogeneity becomes greater as they become older over time. And that there are these key inflection points, the transition into school, and possibly, though we haven't looked at this in detail, the transition into high school, that is a stress point for their developmental trajectories, and then seems to be another point at which is a modifiable risk factor at which you might be able to intervene to make that transition more smooth. So all of this leads to this concept of chronogeneity, which is a term that Stelios came up with in an editorial with Summer Bishop and Tom Fraser. And of course, being Greek, Stelios reached back into the Greek language and put together the term chronos, which is time, a heterogeneity, which is variation, to come up with this idea that autism is a spectrum of chronogeneity, so variation over time. Whoops, did I miss one? Yeah, no. You'll remember that the initial question was, what are the factors that account for a good outcome? And so we wanted to make sure that we returned to that initial question and provided an answer to that question. However, 2004 is a long time ago, and the terms we used, the framework that we were thinking about, the language, it's changed over time, and there's been a lot of discussion, and it's, certainly been a lot of progress. And we as a team had a lot of discussion about this term, quote, a good outcome, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with that particular term. Another term that's used in the literature a lot is an optimal outcome. What are the factors associated with an optimal outcome? And that too was a term that we did not want to adopt. But how to define a good outcome is not immediately obvious. There are issues about who decides what's a good outcome, and what are the criteria for a good outcome. So we decided to drop the term a good outcome because it has sort of moralistic and value-laden concepts, and we didn't want to think about outcomes because that's not an endpoint. And kids in this study were at the beginning of their developmental trajectory. So instead, we adopted the term doing well. So what are the factors associated with doing well? But even that's difficult to define and to think about what is the criteria for somebody who does well. So we looked around in the literature and talked to different people, and our clinical experience with parents and people with autism, asking them about what doing well might mean, and came up with sort of two broad areas. One is you could do well if you reached a certain level of competence. That we defined as proficiency. So are you scoring in the typical range on a particular domain? But also there were kids who did well, who improved significantly over time. They may not reach that level of competence, but still their level of improvement was something to be celebrated and something to be noted. So we had these two domains, proficiency and growth, and they not necessarily overlapping with each other of doing well. Then the next question is, well, what are the different domains that we should include in this concept of doing well? So we held some focus groups with parents in the pathway study, and we asked them, what are the outcome domains that were important to them that we should study at this next phase of our project? And they identified these domains as key for them: communication, social skills, independent living skills, physical health, emotional health, and educational achievement. We then had to look at the database that we had to determine, okay, what measures and tools did we have to capture those outcome domains. We couldn't capture all of them, but we were able to focus on domains such as communication, daily living skills, socialization, internalizing problems, which is anxiety and depression, and behavioral challenges, which are things like attention deficit problems, temper tantrums, difficult behavior, etc. So this part of the study will include 272 kids who were at the age where we could measure these things. We start when they're between 3 and 4 years of age, and our outcome period is between 9 and 11 years of age. And we have these two domains of proficiency and growth. Here's the bottom line. I can't see the numbers well, so I'm going to go over here. But the bottom line is that it's more common to be doing well than we thought. So here you've got the different domains at the bottom, and you've got the kids who are doing well in growth, who are doing well in proficiency, and who are doing well in either growth or proficiency or both. And the bottom line is that 46% are doing well in communication, 45% doing well with internalizing problems. In other words, they had low internalizing problems. 56% doing well with respect to behavioral challenges. There were more kids that were doing well by either growth or proficiency than we had anticipated, given what the literature was. 80% of the kids were doing well in at least one of the domains the parents had identified as important to them. 35% were doing well in 3 or more domains. 57% were doing well in 2 or more domains by either growth or proficiency. So the bottom line that for us is that if you took a comprehensive, holistic approach to the idea of doing well, there are more kids that are doing well than we would have anticipated and that is talked about within the literature. And I think, remember too, that these are kids 2004, where the landscape of kids who were included as being autistic quite different than had been in the literature before. So much of our literature is old-fashioned and hasn't really caught up to the changing demographics of autistic kids. So that's the doing well part of our original question. The second part is, what are the factors associated with doing well? And here's where to want to emphasize that we looked at a number of different child and contextual level variables, including the family, services, school, and community. So this is one particular snapshot that I think is fairly generalizable. So we can remember, you can be doing well by either growth or proficiency on one of those 5 domains. The predictors that we looked at were things like the baseline variable, the baseline ability of that variable. So for example, if you were interested in were they doing well in communication, how were they doing in communication when they started the study at their baseline? We looked at cognition, cognitive variables, language abilities, assigned sex, so these are the child level variables, and we had some contextual variables which included household income, the parent's ability to cope with stress, and family functioning. So we looked at these 7 variables, child and contextual variables, with respect to predicting doing well at 9 to 11 years of age. And the bottom line of this analysis was that there were 4 variables associated in general with doing well. Yes, their ability at the beginning of the study on that particular skill and ability, that was very important. Their language abilities at 2 to 4 years of age, that was important. But contextual variables were also important. So the household income was a significant predictor of how they were going to do, and family functioning. So the higher the income, the greater the likelihood of doing well, the better the family functioned and worked together, the higher the likelihood that that kid would be doing well. So again, this emphasizes the importance of supporting contextual factors in ensuring that autistic kids will do well over time, at least to the point of late childhood. We've always been interested in families and want to make sure and find out how families are doing during the process. And a key finding was that yes, families experience high levels of stress, and those high levels of stress will interact with child characteristics in a kind of circular, reciprocal, cascading way over time. So the greater the stress, the more challenging behaviors, the higher the parent stress over time. So that seemed to be clear. But that could be mitigated, moderated by social supports to the family and family functioning. So this emphasized the importance of not separating out supports to the family, particularly mental health supports to the family, and supports and services for the children. Need to have an integrated program that supports both the caregivers and parents as well as the kids, and not have, a separate service for parents in an adult mental health setting, for example, to support them. That just wasn't feasible or didn't make a lot of sense. So to kind of summarize the doing well parts of our study was that doing well is not uncommon, and that there is significant room for optimism. A child can be doing well in one domain, but not another, and by proficiency, but not necessarily by growth. That implies to us that we need to target all aspects of development in our programs. And doing well is related to individual factors of the child, yes, and to contextual factors, and that we need to provide family-level supports and services to ensure that we give our kids the best chance of doing well over time. These different definitions of doing well can occur even in the context of meeting diagnostic criteria for autism. So this emphasized, another important message was the decentering of the diagnosis of autism as a predictor of outcome over time. Diagnostic status is not a key defining attribute of doing well. That was, I think, another important discovery. We were also interested, and this is, the next 2 slides are some of my favorite findings that we came up with, and this had to do with what are the best things about your kid? So we asked parents, what are some of the best things you can identify about your kids? And we had a very comprehensive and scientific approach to this, but parents identified, we asked them to identify 3 character traits of their kids that they thought were great, and these are the top 6 traits that parents identified: love, happiness, kindness, humor, intelligence, friendliness. So these are the strengths that parents saw in their kids. We asked teachers, what are the 3 positive characteristics that you can identify about that Pathways kid that is in your class? And the top 6 that everybody came up with were kindness, specific skills, self-regulation, happiness, perseverance, and friendliness. So I think this was surprising to us. Many of these you see in typically developing kids, and some are specific, the autistic kids as well, like specific skills and perseverance. These are real strengths that autistic kids show, and that is something that we can really think about and take advantage of. So we mustn't forget strengths and resilience is another important theme that comes out of the Pathway study. So bottom line, autistic children follow different pathways over time. This new concept of chronogeneity, which highlights the important variation between autistic people at one point in time and within the same person over time. That long-term prediction is impossible. This is one of the most common questions I get asked at the initial diagnosis. Doctor, how will he end up? And I think I'm very confident in saying, I don't know, but that we have to make sure and we follow him over time to make sure he has the best chance of doing well as much as possible. Given all this variation and heterogeneity, it can be dizzying, but a one-size-fits-all approach to early diagnosis and supports and services will not work. Our supports and services have to be as heterogeneous as the kids. They have to be tailored. They have to be personalized to take account of all that variation. And then I think it was really interesting that there was variation in the relative importance of factors associated with doing well on a particular domain. The initial score, the initial ability they had in that domain, which to me says we need to intervene before the diagnosis to make sure they have the best chance as they start on their trajectory. But then family and SES variables, more important than other child-level variables like IQ and language. And the least important in our study were the services that they received. I didn't show you that in detail, but we couldn't really find that the services that they received across Canada, across the different provinces, was a significant predictor of how they were going to do. It's very difficult to get and collect service data from parents because it's so complicated. So maybe it had to do with the way we collected the data. We're going to look at it in the next couple of years in more detail, but at least what we know now, services did not have an important power in predicting outcome. Now, ignore this. If you're listening in French, ignore that slide. You got to look at the English one. I can't change because I'll lose that one, so I apologize because I changed my slides this morning too late for the French ones. But clinical and policy implications, reduce the time lag between parental concern and getting a formal diagnosis. Provide supports and services across the lifespan, especially at these transition points, so that we can pinpoint when we should be intervening and providing more and more resources. Provide income supplements. Again, the importance of income in predicting doing well. So providing income supplements to support families to help them with the resources that they need seem to be an important variable. Parents should also, planning should also focus on supporting strengths and addressing these contextual factors like parent stress, like family functioning, and highlighting the strengths that the kids could show over time. Our autism services need to also support caregiver mental health. It needs to be integrated in a collaborative kind of way. And then finally, the importance of listening to autism voices. And even those voices who you might think at the beginning, those who don't have verbal skills, there are ways of collecting information, which we did, which I think was very informative and important, and that's becoming increasing importance as we go on. So just a sneak peek at what the future holds for Pathways. I'm going to call it Pathways in Context. This is being led by Dr. Terry Bennett from McMaster. I'm stepping down because I can't get my slides right, and it's clear that I'm aging out of this particular process. So Terry's going to be taking over leadership for the study, and we're thinking about it as Pathways in Context. I think we've learned that doing well is not one size fits all, that context matters, family, community, schools, and jobs. So we need to pay attention to that. Remember, the kids are now transitioning from 18, 19, 20, out of high school into their transition-aged youth period, emerging adulthood. So what does Pathways look like as we follow the kids over time? However, we are very sensitive to the fact that many autistic people are not represented by the Pathways participant group. So the kids that we have, for example, are not that representative of Canada. Remember, Canada's changed a lot over the last 25 years, particularly with marginalized populations just aren't represented in the Pathways cohort. And I think we can do a better job of integrating the unique voices of a broad spectrum of autistic people in our planning, in our thinking. So these are some of the things that'll help us inform the next steps in Pathways, which is resetting the study. We intend to elicit and describe what different autistic people prefer for themselves for doing well. Remember, we asked parents. We weren't able to ask autistic people themselves at that stage. We want to engage and integrate the voices of people who were not represented in the initial Pathway study and make sure that they're included in this next step. And we need to work harder to understand the views who face barriers in Canada due to intersectionality and to other factors that impinge upon people's right for a happy and productive life. I showed you a picture of the current Pathways team. This is just a picture of what it looked like at the very beginning with many of the research staff. Susan Bryson, I have to highlight, Wendy Roberts, Pat Miranda. These were towering figures in Pathways that were with us at the beginning that exerted such an important influence. And of course, I want to thank and acknowledge the children, the youth, and the families that have participated in the study for many, many years. A huge thanks to the study team, all the students that have worked with us and have benefited from participation, and the amazing research staff that we have. And then finally, all the funders who have stuck with us over these decades. Thank you very much, everybody.
I think John was going to come up here and take some questions and moderate.
Okay.
So we're not going to have time for questions. We're going to go straight to break. Just a few things before we go to break, and Maddie's going to explain some of the outro points. This morning and yesterday morning, we failed to acknowledge the lands that we are on, and I apologize for that. We did that on day one, but we should ground ourselves in where we are, and that's an apologies coming from me. So I do acknowledge that we are all right now and have been currently on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, a nation that I have been a privilege to be visiting, actually, driving up from my area in Toronto, and whose presence in this area, in this Ottawa watershed area, have been here from time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and lift the voice and value of our host nations. And as this past talk reflected in this study that started over 20 years ago, I think I've had some feedback about how language, how framing of some of these issues have changed from a medical model into sort of how we think about autism. And we acknowledge that there are differences in how we see things and how people express things, and that some people may feel may feel hurt by and feel burdened by some how things, and I think it's a learning opportunity reflecting the positive of how we've changed in some of how we think as a culture, as a society, to have a more human rights approach. And I do want to thank the Human Rights Commission and all our speakers this morning, Anna Betty, the DGC, for being able to come and speak about different perspectives from a rights-based lens, how we move forward as a country. I think we are making change. Today is about innovation, and innovation reflects where we've been and where we are now and where we are going. We are learning as a community, and we will continue to do so. That is how we improve as a country and make a better Canada for all of us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maddie Dever.
Thank you very much. So it's break time, our morning break. I think it's been a very impactful morning. During the break, we invite you to take an opportunity to go into the hall outside where our exhibitors from some of our top supporters are there. Grab a coffee, take a look at what some of them are doing, and stretch your legs. Or you can visit the Zen Den, which is in the Laurier room next door, if you want to have a chance to look at the sensory-friendly room. If you would like to share the testimonial about the summit, head over to the Autism Alliance of Canada's booth to give your testimonies, and after the break, we will reconvene in two places. So in this room, you will hear from the presenters of the Accessibility Institute of Carleton University, who will be showcasing learnings about the connections, sorry, I apologize, learning about the connections between various decision makers, collaborators, and roles in the housing ecosystem in the adjoining room, the Laurier room. We will, to the right of us, to the right of this room, when you exit, researchers, trainees, and members of the autistic and autism communities will share findings and gather feedback on key elements of building an impactful national research network. And one note, in the Laurier room, in the parallel session, we do not have French translation. So at this time, I invite you to enjoy your break, and we'll be back here at 11:30 and in the Laurier room.